Great. Now let me see if I can get the PowerPoint to work. Not so much. Oops. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on parents' perspectives on the impact of COVID on college students. And we have a really exciting session for you to share with you today. We're super excited that you're here with us. I'm going to introduce the panelists and who you'll be hearing from, and then we'll get started. So first off, I'm Jodi Dworkin. I'm a professor and extension specialist at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Family Social Science, and have been studying families and college students for almost 20 years now. And we're excited to share what we've been learning. My colleague who's now saying, oh my, is Marjorie Savage, who we've been working together for that whole time, is nationally known for her work in parent and family programming. And you may be familiar with her book that she's written on I'm Here If You Need Me. I don't have the full title there, Marge. And has been doing this great work for a while. Our other presenters are Kathy Vasquez and Samantha LaBeouf, who are doctoral students in the Department of Family Social Science. And Liz Ruska is an assistant director in career and internship services at the University of Minnesota. So welcome to all of you. You have a chance to hear from all of us today. So we'll each be presenting some different content. We have gone through the registrations as well. So some of you shared questions at the time that you registered. And so hopefully we will cover that. We will also have time for questions throughout. Kathy is going to be monitoring our chat as well. Please, we encourage you to engage in the chat, engage with each other, engage with us, and we will do our best to get to those questions. So we have three objectives today for our time together. The first is that we're going to hopefully help you understand how COVID has impacted families' experience of higher ed in both positive and negative ways. So how has COVID impacted experiences? We're also going to spend time reflecting on how parents' reports of students' well-being has changed over time, has changed over the course of COVID. We'll think about which students are more vulnerable to negative impacts to their college trajectory as a result of COVID, and what that has looked like. And we'll also think about how colleges and universities might support families in new and different ways as students are now have now been returning to campus.
Well, welcome and thanks for joining us today. The first question we wanted to address is, why did we even bother to ask parents? When the pandemic began, we were hearing a lot in the national media about how students and maybe especially 2020 high school seniors were responding to the pandemic, but there wasn't much being said about what was happening among families as a whole. Now, we already know that parents are engaged with their students' higher education in a lot of different ways, including what school will they go to, discussions related to what's going on campus, how is their student doing, learning about college resources so that parents can, and they do, refer their students to those resources, certainly financial support, and more addressing mental health concerns. We know that family engagement is critical to student success. And what we were learning from our colleagues around the country is that COVID-19 made families more prominent in higher education than ever. Schools were definitely reaching out to them. So the next slide. Thank you. A little background on how we did this survey. We conducted this study in 3 waves, and we'll mostly be talking about the 3rd wave today, but we wanted to give you a little background on the timing of this whole study. The idea of multiple waves was to capture 3 moments in time during the pandemic to see what was happening over time. Throughout the pandemic, though, changes were happening quickly. And families were going through some vastly different circumstances within the time frame of each of these surveys. Wave 1 was conducted in summer 2020. At that point, most parents had a lot of faith in their students' school. About 84% of them thought the schools had made the right decision when they shut down in March of 2020. That summer, most thought their students' school would be returning to normal for fall of 2020. About a third of them expected their students' school to fully reopen for fall semester, and around half expected a hybrid mix with classes partly in person and partly online. The vast majority thought their student would be living on campus or in an apartment or house near campus. But schools were changing their plans throughout that summer. The confidence that families had in the early part of the summer, that schools would fully open and students would return to campus, that all faded as one school after another changed their plans. Wave 2 was the fall of 2020, so a year ago. Students were technically back in school, but things didn't return to normal. Some schools announced shutdowns right before students were scheduled to arrive on campus or shortly after. New outbreaks after classes started meant schools were shutting down campus for a few weeks or longer. Students were being asked to isolate. Decisions were being made to close campus from Thanksgiving through the rest of the semester. Parents didn't know what was going to be happening second semester. So there was a significant drop compared to the first wave about whether families thought the school was even making the right decisions. That 84% who thought schools were making the right decisions during the summer, that bottomed out at just 60% approving of decisions. And families at that point were deeply concerned about student mental health, student engagement, and the challenges of online learning and isolation. So wave 3, this fall, this is the new information. Everyone, students, parents, and probably all of us on this webinar, were feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. But based on their comments, families tended to be seeing this semester as sort of a time of recovery. At the same time, though, students and parents were trying to figure out what the residual effects were from being off campus, being isolated, and the outcome of poor success with the online learning of the previous year. And frustration grew about ever-changing mask mandates and vaccine requirements. So that's the context of our study, and now we'll take a deeper look at some of the survey results.
Okay, so who were these parents and how did we find them? Parents were from all 50 states and they represented more than 75 institutions. Parents were recruited through AHEP, which is the National Association for Professionals who work with parents and families of college students. They shared a recruitment message with over 200 institutions. Parents who chose to participate could click on a link to complete a 15-minute online survey via Qualtrics. And all participants had the opportunity to be entered into a chance drawing to win one of 5 $100 electronic gift cards. The parents answered a survey and open-ended questions about various aspects of their student situation and experiences in college during the pandemic, as well as measures related to their child and their own mental health. So as Marge just shared, data was collected over 3 time points, and we just finished collecting the third wave, and that's what we'll primarily focus on here today. So in wave 3, there were 1,934 parents who participated. 23.1% of those parents reported having less than a 4-year degree. 8.4% reported their students were living at home, and 12% were parents of color.
So we know that COVID-19 has been really hard for families and that there have been many losses. And some families have also talked about growing and developing at the same time. In wave 3 of our data collection, we were interested to learn of any benefits to be found with families amidst the challenges of the pandemic. We asked parents of college students to share more about how COVID-19 has impacted their students and their families, especially any benefits such as growth or resilience. We were pleased to learn that indeed there were several areas of positive development. What you are seeing is information from the families who either said strongly agree or agree to our questions. So 48.9% of our families said that COVID-19 has helped my student know how much they are loved. 41.6% said it has helped their student become a stronger person. 39.8% said that their student has learned to deal better with their problems. 38.5% said that COVID-19 has helped their student to be more caring of others. 37.7% said that their student has become more patient. 32.4% said that this pandemic had helped their student to learn who their real friends were. And 18.7% said that COVID-19 has even helped their student to make some new best friends. For all of these questions that we're sharing stats on, we're sharing for families who said either strongly agree or agree. With each question, there was also a large group of families who said that they neither disagreed nor agreed. So essentially there was no change for their students or families. And there was also a smaller group of families who said disagree or strongly agree in response to these questions. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that for those families who said no change or that they disagreed, that their student doesn't know how much they're loved, for example. It's just that families have felt the impact of COVID-19 differently. So continuing on in our exploration of resilience and growth, here you can see more evidence of the possibilities COVID-19 has presented for positive family development. And again, these are families who said strongly agree or agree to our questions. 53.5% of our families said that COVID-19 has taught my student what's really important in life. 47.7% said that COVID-19 has taught my student to be happy and to enjoy good things when they happen. 38.5% said that COVID-19 has taught my student to be more caring of others. And 53.5% of our families said that COVID-19 has brought my family closer together. We were pleased to learn that for some of the families, many of the families we connected with, COVID-19 has actually presented some compelling opportunities for positive growth and development. When we look at the ways that students were connecting with their colleges and universities for help, we also found some interesting information as shared by their families. So campus supports were leveraged, especially virtual meetings with academic advisors, with 49.6% of students using that resource. Learning supports from instructors or tutors were used by 12.8% of students, and 12.5% of students took this as an opportunity to change their grading basis from a letter grade to pass-fail. And even some 5.7% of students loaded their semesters with more credits than they would normally take. We did see a small number of students, 1.5% say that they were going to apply to graduate or professional school since most standardized testing requirements were waived due to the pandemic. And we found this quote from a parent interesting. So the quote is, "My student did change majors due to deciding that they could now handle the medical aspects of the field that they have always been interested in, but were afraid to try freshman year. It's going great." Continuing in our examination of student supports, despite the career-related concerns that we heard repeatedly and throughout from parents, there was limited student engagement with university career supports, with only 4 to 6% of students using resources like remote internships or employment, virtual mentoring, online career fairs, or virtual meetings with a career coach like me. So with these career numbers, we think it's possible that parents could be unaware of the day-to-day but low accessing of supports. We also saw students were utilizing wellness services like telemental health, with 19.3% of students working virtually with their therapists or counselors, and 17.7% of students engaging in telehealth meetings with their doctors and physical healthcare providers. One parent spoke positively of the opportunities presented in this new virtual world, saying that their student engaged in virtual college fairs, campus tours, and info sessions, and also an in-person extracurricular sports activity that their student would not have been able to do if the school had not been remote.
We are now going to share a poll. So as Liz has talked about, we've seen a lot of changes across campuses. So what pandemic era changes would you like to see made permanent at your institution? I'm going to pull up the poll here. And we will give you a few seconds to indicate your response. We've all been spending a lot of time thinking about these changes and how they've been working, and some work well, others not so well. Give you a few more seconds here. It looks like greater supports for students' mental and physical health has the most responses currently. Hopefully you can all see that. Can you see that, Kathy? Give me the thumbs up if that's showing. Thank you. Okay. I never quite know if it's sharing or not. So you can see there's a range of responses, but almost 60% of you said the greater supports for students' mental and physical health is something that you would like to see, that you'd absolutely like to see continue. Feel free to use the chat to share examples of things that have happened at your institution that you would like to see made permanent. If there are things that have stood out to you that you feel like have worked really well in support of students and families that that you're hoping the institution will adopt.
Okay, and I think those results are a good segue into our family well-being. So this data on family well-being comes from that most recent wave of data collection, wave 3. So parents were asked to identify how many life events they had experienced, if any, during the past 6 months, and they were presented with 12 events. And out of the 12 events, parents on average reported experiencing 2 life events during the COVID-19 pandemic. The bar graph on the left represents some of the sample events that we asked. So mental health crisis, loss of a job, reduced income, having a close friend, neighbor, or relative deal with a serious problem, or no events. So number of events ranged from 1 to 10 events during the past 6 months, with 44.3% of parents reporting experiencing only 1 event, 27.2% experienced 2 events, 28.2% experienced 3 or more events. So parents were also asked how often they've been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly. And as you can see in the pie chart on the right, very few parents reported almost never. So taken together, these 2 depictions tell us that a lot of different things were coming up for families during the pandemic, in addition to trying to help their college students. And for parents specifically, this data also comes from the wave 3. 45% of parents reported feeling stressed or nervous during the past month. However, while families can be really stressed, they can also experience growth and some positives, as Liz kind of mentioned earlier, and that we see here. So 47.2% of parents reported they felt they always had people they could talk to if they were upset. And so while parents are reporting some higher rates of stress, they are also reporting high rates of support as well.
Okay, for our wave 3 data collection, we also asked some additional questions in the survey, such as if your student experienced a change in career or academic goals, tell us more about that change, what brought about that change, and how they are doing now. From these questions, 4 themes emerged from parents to illustrate the wave 3 recovery. First, as Liz previously mentioned, we saw many examples of positive program or major changes, including this example. My son decided to add a computer science major to his current degree because so many things are now tech dependent. Second, we heard from parents that their students had previously experienced setbacks due to COVID, but now we're back on track. Like in this example, my student missed out on lots last year. All classes were online and ended up bringing him home for the spring semester. He wasn't able to take several of his classes at the local junior college, but this year seems to be back to normal, and I am very glad. Third, we had many parents provide examples of how COVID-19 had impacted their students' career exploration and planning, including this example. When COVID shut down almost every business, my student noticed which professions were still employed and chose within those professions for an academic major. Finally, we had some parents mention university, faculty, and staff accommodations that were made in order to help students cope with the pandemic, including this example from a parent. University and support services decided to change in order for him to graduate.
Great. So there's clearly a lot going on, both for institutions and students, but also for families. For those of you who are working with either students or families, or have your own students, have you noticed a change in students and families this fall? So a change maybe in the questions they ask, the information they need. It could be, again, it could be your own student. It could also be the students or families you work with. So I'm going to put up a poll here so we can get a sense of where folks are at. So have you noticed some changes? Lots of yeses right now. We'll give you a couple more seconds here. And those of you who are saying yes, if we were all together, we could have you talk in groups or call on you. Since we're not, we're going to invite you to use the chat to share some examples of some of the changes you've noticed. So feel free to type those in the chat, and then we'll be able to share those with everyone. So we're going to give you a minute or so to do that. So overwhelmingly, yes. So we know there's lots of examples out there. So we'll wait a few seconds to give you a chance to share some of those. Right, so students preferring to have advising appointments on Zoom, more mental health issues, struggling with feeling like whether you're not in college. There's a sense of loss that I think we haven't really talked about, both for families and students, and the expectations of what they thought college would be like. And for students who have started anytime during this pandemic, we're now in our third academic year of COVID. So it's nothing like what most people were planning. Missed opportunities, more concern about student engagement, more parent interaction. Yeah, parents have seen what's going on with their student in ways that they never would have before, right? A lot more kind of forced family engagement in a lot of families. Discrepancies between maybe what families want for their students or what they think the college experience should look like for their students and what students may prefer. Lots of mental health concerns. less trust in the university. I think when Marge started us off, it's been a wild ride, right? I mean, and really very different moments in time throughout COVID. Great. Yeah, and I think, Marge, I know you've talked about this, hearing from parents more than ever about concerns about like social interactions and sort of the ways that students were engaged with, when in the past questions may have been more academically focused from parents and families. So that's been a big shift in thinking more broadly about the opportunities that college provides outside of the classroom. Great, thank you for sharing. Please continue to use the chat and share those. One of the things we've wanted to understand as we've surveyed families is, I think a lot of what was coming up in your comments here. So outside of challenges with online learning, which we knew, right? We knew that online learning was hard for instructors and hard for students. What were students and parents most concerned about? What concerns were students bringing to parents? And then how much were parents really able to help? And so these are the top concerns that students most frequently requested advice from their parents. So finances, about a third said finances, stress, and academics, and about a quarter said housing, personal relationships, health, and safety. So it's really clear from this data that students are coming to parents, and parents could identify more than one of these. So these are not mutually exclusive. So they didn't have to pick one. We then asked parents, how much help were you able to provide your student? And this is the number of parents who said they were able to provide a great deal or quite a bit of help. And overall, parents were pretty confident in their ability to provide their student with support. And so it's interesting to think about, students maybe living in different spaces than they might have pre-COVID, but they were clearly turning to their parents and families for support. And parents felt like they were doing an okay job kind of responding and really providing that help for students. The reverse was also true, though. So it was also clear from these data that parents were also turning to their student with questions. So about 2/3 of parents said they would go to their student when they had questions, that's where they would start. And we found that information made a difference for students. So when parents didn't feel confident about the information that they received from institutions, or they didn't know who to turn to for help when they had questions, those students, they were also more likely to report that their students were likely to change their graduation plans. Okay, so when parents can have the information they need, when they feel like they know who to go to when they have a question, that makes a difference for how their students were doing. So there was just a question, it looked like, about first-gen students, and we're going to share that. Oh, we're going to share that in a minute. Thanks, Samantha. You're one step ahead, you and Kathy. Okay. So these are data. These are data from the full sample. And as we said, we had 3 waves of data. So we wanted to just share a little bit about how student well-being has changed over time. So over the 1.5 years during which we collected data. So we asked parents to report on their students' well-being. And what you see, if you look on the left, which is overall sense of well-being, if you look at the extremes where you ask, how many parents reported their students' well-being was poor or fair, you see a pretty big increase at wave 2. So that was a year ago, which last year was our sort of full COVID year, if you want to think about it that way. And you see a lot more parents reporting their students as poor and fair, and a lot fewer parents reporting their student overall well-being as excellent. Okay, so last year, seems to have been a blip, which is maybe the good news, right? Because when we look at our current data, which we just finished collecting, there seems to be some recovery. So the data goes back to what it looked like at the first wave. So this is, we're thinking about maybe there's some sort of rebound here. We don't quite know. I mean, I think we still have a lot to learn. It's too soon, I think, to draw a lot of those conclusions. And there's certainly a lot of individual differences that we'll talk a little bit about, but there's a lot more we have a lot more to learn about that. And the same is generally true when you look at personal relationships. There was this sort of blip for year 2. So a year ago, again, where more parents reporting their students' relationships were poor or fair, fewer reporting those relationships as excellent. And when you look at the poor or fair actually post in wave 3 and personal relationships, that's actually at the lowest point under poor or fair. So we see an increase in excellent. So there may be some relationships that have been students' relationships that have improved or are doing better over time. When we did look at differences by parents of color and first generation students. They reported greater well-being at all 3 waves, but they showed the same pattern. So the patterns look the same. And the same was true for personal relationships. So parents of color and first generation students reported more positive personal relationships across the board. The differences were fairly small, but again, we see the same sort of pattern where last year looks like it was particularly hard for students, and hopefully we're starting to see some changes to that. Okay. The data look a little bit different though when we look at graduation, which we'll talk about next. This quote from a parent really highlights a lot of what was going on a year ago, where a parent said, "I'm concerned that many lessons in life skills are being delayed and will have to be learned during sophomore year when coursework is harder, stakes are higher, and second year students are not as fully supported as first years." So there was definitely some concern about first year students who were starting at a time when things looked really different, and would institutions pivot and make changes to support those students as they went into their second year and now into their third year, if that was depending on when they started. So this is, let me talk through this because it looks a little bit confusing. We were trying to present to visually show some of the differences. We asked parents about whether or not their student was going to make any changes to their academic plans, and whether or not their student was still on track to graduate. And what you see here is you can see the full sample is the darker color, and you see from wave 1 to wave 2, there was an increase in the number of students who changed their plans, and then there's been kind of a steady increase across all 3 waves. When you look at time to graduation, again, we see a big decrease from wave 1 to wave 2, right? So after that first spring, when schools shut down, there was some concern about delays to graduation. There was a big drop there, and then it stayed the same from wave 3, right? So fewer parents of students thought they were on track to graduate at wave 2 and 3 than they did at wave 1. So there was a big change there. But when we looked at reports from parents of color and from first generation students, we don't see those same patterns, right? We see really different relationships. So when we look at first generation students who were on track to graduate, there wasn't much change. About 83% at wave 1 said they were still on track to graduate. At wave 2, that was 87%, and at wave 3, it was 84%. So we didn't see the same drop as we did when we looked at the full sample. When we looked at the first generation students who changed their plans, however, we saw at that first point, about 38% said they were going to change their plans. And then that went down to 18% and 20%. So it was much higher at wave 1, where students pivoted and made shifts that when you look at this data as a whole, didn't necessarily impact their time to degree, right? They may have made changes that actually allowed them to stay on track to graduate in the time that they were expecting, but they did change their plans. It was similar for parents of color. We don't have this data for time 1, but when we looked at time 2 and time 3, parents of color reported that their students were still on track to graduate. So wave 2 and 3, it was 84 and 85%. And the students who changed their plans at wave 2 is about 21%, and the same thing at wave 3. So small differences from when we looked at the full sample. But again, we didn't see those same sorts of changes when we looked at students of color and we looked at first generation students. So there's a lot of questions here, I think, and Liz started to address some of the growth that may have happened for students. There's a range of things that were going on, and students' experiences of COVID and the family experience of COVID and how it's impacting students is not consistent. There's not one story. There's lots of stories here, and I think we'll see lots of different trajectories kind of going forward.
So what does all this mean for families? And what does it mean for higher education in terms of working with families? A major lesson learned is that in a time of crisis, colleges and universities need parents' help. Families responded to campus communications during the pandemic. They used the information students sent or schools sent. And it's important moving forward to keep administrators focused on the value of family engagement. During the pandemic, parents and students problem solved together. They're going to continue to do that. It's simply not the same world right now. And whether it ever goes back, that's a question. It's not going to fully probably go back. It will shift a little, but I think families have learned that they do work together in terms of getting their students support, in terms of helping them make decisions. So they're probably going to stick with it. Now, at the same time, families did not always support the policies that were put in place during the pandemic. People feel differently about mask mandates, vaccines, quarantine, and isolation. Among the greatest frustrations for families during this was the rapid change of policies or the lack of clarity about how decisions were being made, or in some cases, who was making them. Schools may have allowed in-person classes, but then faculty could decide to be online only. Flare-ups in one residence hall meant students were quarantined while the rest of the campus might remain open. Students were ordered to mask on campus, but football games were a different story. So a lot of families are still questioning schools' decisions. We are going to need to hear and respond to those concerns and not just shift them off and say, well, that was a different time. Colleges and universities are now in the process of reinstating some of those policies that they were slack about during the pandemic. Students and their families benefited from some of those policies, and they'll be advocating for keeping those. We have to pass those concerns on to our colleagues. There are likely to be significant long-term differences between upperclassmen who experienced college before and those who haven't had a full year of college yet without COVID. There is genuine trauma for some students. Others function well, and as the survey showed, some even grew due to the challenges. So we have to figure out how to level that playing field. And we can't do it alone. We have to rely on the institution and our colleagues in different offices around campus. Moving into post-college success, what do schools need to be thinking about? Maybe students will be better prepared for a hybrid workforce. How does all this affect major selection, career advising, job preparation, or does it affect it at all? Moving forward, we all need to keep observing and tracking our successes and failures, watching what families are doing that might be different, helping them understand what the policies and procedures are and the why of it, and adapting as needed. It's important for us who work with colleges on campus and the families off campus to keep that communication going and make sure that parents' concerns are heard. Keep the parent perspective in the picture. And that includes those positive development points. I think those were really kind of a telling piece. So yeah, this just is not over yet.
So what are some of the key things we've learned from this data? And like I've said, and I think we've all said, we still have a lot to learn. So hopefully we're going to continue to learn more about this. The first is that the decisions that institutions made not only impacted the entire campus community, but they also impacted families. Families were experiencing tremendous stress around finances, physical and mental health, and we heard that from all of you in the chat. And they had to figure out how to support their students in new ways. And families also reported some growth in learning, right? So some families said, well, it was really great to have my student home and we got to reconnect in ways that were really important. And that's super hard. So there's this sort of paradox, I think, that families were experiencing of there were some benefits that were also really, really hard and really challenging. Parents shared some really profound stories about the extreme ways their students were impacted, how vulnerable their students were in terms of their mental health and being derailed from either dropping out or delaying graduation or questioning the value of college, whether they should even continue. Families had to make some really hard choices. Families were, thinking about COVID rates. So do I send my child, the state we're living in has really high COVID rates, but their school is in a state where the COVID rates are much better. So I maybe want to send them away to school. Or if I send my student across the country and the school shuts down again, how do I pick them up? So just lots of new challenges that that left families and students really vulnerable to change and to some of these impacts. Families were also really insightful in sharing with us what worked and what didn't, as institutions tried to figure out how to support families in new and different ways. As students are returning to campus, we know that institutions were really quick to pivot and innovative in the types of strategies and supports they were providing to Parents Weekend Online, to a range of things to really engage families in new ways. And now we need to think about what do we continue with? What do we need to change again? What's working, what's not working? So these are some of the key things we've learned. We want to leave a little bit of time now for questions that you all have, things that maybe we didn't talk about or things we only talked a little bit about that you want to hear more. So we'll invite you in the chat to share some of those questions. And also, if you have ideas about how you might use any of this in your work, please go ahead and share that as well. As we mentioned, the recording will be shared. This is our website. If you go to this website, you can find a full report of the wave 1 and wave 2 data. You just got to scroll down a little bit and there's a link to a full summary report from both the first 2 waves of data. We literally just finished collecting wave 3 like a week or 2 ago. So this is like hot off the press. And we will have a full summary report up there soon as well. So check out our website for those reports also. So we're going to pause, see what questions you have and what ideas you have about how you might use some of this information in your work. Great, thanks, Kathy. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We'll hang out for a few more minutes. So if you have a question, please pop that into the chat and we will stay on to answer that. So have a great